We'll continue to use our child theme to modify our website. What we're going to be working on next is we are going to customize our navigation and we're going to add a hero image. We'll go ahead and be making our navigation sticky and add some JavaScript to make it a little bit extra fancy. Let's dive in. Here's what the website currently looks like. The navigation is a standard navigation, and although it works, it doesn't really enhance our website. Let's see what we can do to make this look a little bit better. I'll begin by going into my appearance editor, and I'm going to go into the navigation section. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to augment the navigation. So what we want to do here is we want to rearrange the items. I'm going to be dragging the join a trip to the end. The home navigational link is not something that I want to have, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. And we'll leave the About Us with the testimonials underneath it, blog, and contact. The next thing that I want to do is I want to alter the header section of my page. I'm going to go into patterns, and what we want to modify is our header. So I'm going to click header, and here are the current headers. This is the header that is currently being used, so this is the one that I will modify. I'll click this, which takes me into the editor. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up my list view. Instead of having the mar text, we are going to be using our logo instead. So if we open up this group, which is the header, you can see that there is a row with the site title and then a row that contains our navigational elements. I'll go ahead and I will click the plus sign to add an image. And I'm going to grab an image from my media library. Here's my logo. If we go back to list view, you can see that the image exists, but we are not seeing it right now. And that is partially because of the size of the element. With the image selected, I'll set the width to 120 and I'll let the height just be what it naturally needs to be. For whatever reason in WordPress, it's going to set the height to be the same value. Although this is clearly not a square, it's more of a rectangle, but this should work for our purposes. The next thing I want to do is I want to change the order of these elements. I want the image to be first and then the site title. Because of how the header is currently being used, these elements are going to be pushed aside. So I will select them both. We're going to group these together. I'm using the keyboard shortcut of Command or Control G. This, of course, is going to stack them on top of each other, and then we can come over here and just transform this to a row. So now we'll have our logo, and then we'll have this site title, which ultimately we're going to remove. I'm going to select the overall container, which is this grouped area right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the background color of our nav element. With this group selected, I'll go into the style section. And I'm going to change the background color. I will click on the color element and I'll plug in the hex value that I want, which is this dark blue. And then we're going to change all of the text color to be white. The final thing that I'm going to do while I'm augmenting this is I will select the last navigation item, which is join a trip. We're going to style this so it stands out and looks a little bit more like a button. And in order to do this, I'm going to need to go into the advanced section and add an additional class. So we'll give this a class name of trip BTN so that we can grab this with CSS and style it in the way that we want. If I save this and we go back out to the front end section of WordPress, you can see here is our new header. The other element that I want to do is I want the logo itself to be a link back to the homepage. Currently, it is not a link. We will select the image. I'm going to come right here to link, and I'll just type home, and we'll have this link to the homepage. And I'm going to apply these changes. This will ensure that this is going to be a link. And at this point, we don't really need the site title. We can go ahead and click these three dots right here and choose to delete that. And now if we hit save and we refresh, you can see that this is now a link back to the home page, and the navigation is going to be persistent on all pages. And when we click this, it goes back to the home page. So that part is looking good. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to add a hero element to my header template. We will do this by adding a cover image to start off with. So I'm going to search for cover. I'll insert a cover image, and I'm going to go to my media library and grab an image. And this did not get inserted in the right place, so I need to come in here and remove this from the navigation group. So I'll just pull this out so that it appears after the navigation, like so. And now I can begin by editing the elements. I'm going to delete this paragraph. Then inside the cover image, I'm going to add a column block. And I'm going to create a column that is roughly 33 by 66%. We'll ultimately be augmenting this, but that's what I'll start off with. So inside my first column, and I actually want this in the cover, so let's just pull this up to the cover so it becomes an element that is inside of the cover image. And then in the first column, I'm going to add an image. And once again, in my media library, I have this image that I want to use. Sometimes in WordPress, it's a little difficult to get the element into the appropriate place, but with the list view, it's really easy just to augment things and move them around. Next, we're going to click in the second column, and in this column, I'm going to create a couple of different elements. So we'll start off by making a headline, and while I'm here, I'm just going to grab the other elements. I'll also add a paragraph, and I'm going to add a button. And these are not where I want them to be, but I'm going to change that anyways. So we'll go back into list view. And here are our columns. I'll drag the headline to column 1. Looks like my paragraph disappeared, so we'll have to augment that, but let's change what the headline says right here. I'll hit return so that I can get a paragraph of text, and I'll insert the text that I want to appear here. And then finally, I'm going to have my button, so I'm just going to drag that so that it becomes part of this block. And we'll change the text to say, learn more about our trips. So now I have this organized pretty much in the way that I want. I'm going to change my heading right here to be an H1. And then I will make some modifications using the style tab. So with the heading, we're going to go into our typography, and we want to change the transform to be uppercase so that this is all uppercase. And actually, now that I'm looking at this as uppercase, it seems a little big. So let's go ahead and change the size of this. Maybe I ultimately might just make this into an H2. That looks a little bit better. And with my paragraph, I'm going to select my paragraph right here. I'm going to go into typography, and I'm just going to turn on the font area. We're going to be using the Lato font. Then I'm going to not worry about my button. We'll be styling this with some custom CSS. So that takes care roughly of how I want this to look. Ultimately, I'm going to be augmenting my columns, but I actually find it a little bit easier just to do this with custom CSS. Although you're somewhat able to modify the columns, you have a lot more control with CSS. So I'm not going to worry about that. And the final thing that I want to do is just make sure I don't have any extra spacing between these elements. I want to have these touching. So I'm just going to make sure that there's no padding or margin on any of these elements. And it looks like that's what's causing it right here. I've mentioned this before. For whatever reason, WordPress, even though it's set to none by default, it usually has some margin set in there. So let's just set that. I'll save this, and I'm going to check it out in my front end. And now my pages should have this nice big hero image along with the navigation. This, of course, is going to persist on all of our pages because we built this into our header. And before I actually leave this area, I'm going to go into my cover, and there's a blue overlay on my image. I'm just going to make this black, and I'm going to reduce the opacity way down to maybe like 20% so that more of the true colors of the image is going to appear. And I'll save that. So this is the basis for what I want to have on my page, but we are going to augment the layout of this a little bit. I am going to reduce the height of my navigation. I'm going to bring these things a little bit closer together. And if we check out our page at a small screen, you can see that it's going to obviously create our hamburger menu, which is what we want. I don't like the alignment of these. I'd rather have them be center aligned, and this button needs to change. So those are all things that we're going to customize through our child theme. And I'll just leave my inspector open as we are going to need that. Before I actually get into making some of these modifications, I want to make sure that I'm able to hook the elements and style them in the way that I want. A lot of the CSS classes that are being applied to these things are just the default CSS classes that are part of WordPress, WP block cover, WP block template, block group, etc. So in order to make this a little bit easier to hook, I'm going to come to my cover element, which is this entire thing. We're going to go to the settings area, and down at the bottom under advanced, we're just going to give this a class of hero. And I know that I'm going to want to be able to control my columns a little bit more uniquely. So I'm going to select this first column. We'll go into advanced, and we're going to give this a class of call pick. And then I'm going to select the second column, and we'll give this a class of call text. And finally, on my button, I'm going to give my button element a class name as well. So I'll select the button itself, and we'll go ahead and give this a class of BTN wrapper. And I'm just going to save these changes. So obviously those class names haven't affected any of these elements, but if we do select them inside of our inspector, you can see that our custom classes have now been applied. So this will give me an easy way to be able to isolate these elements and make the changes that I want. Let's go into our code editor so that we can start to modify some of these things. The first thing that I want to do is I want to reduce the height of my navigational element. And you can see that this is a header. Inside this is a div which wraps around the navigation, and there's some nested divs inside of that as well. And actually, before we move on, just to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to come into this group element right here, and let's just get the overall container that is containing our navigation, and let's give that a custom class of nav. And if we go back to the front end, you can see that our nav class has been applied. I'll switch into my code editor, and let's go ahead and make a comment down here, and I'll just call this nav. And then I'm just going to add another comment that says hero, since those are two things that I will be modifying. I've mentioned this to you before as well, but a lot of times if you're not sure what the values are, this is something that you can easily do in the developer tool. So if I make a new selector and I'm just going to type .nav, then I can go ahead and start to experiment around with some of these settings and see if I make changes such as altering the height, how that's going to affect this element. You can see it does reduce the size, but we have a lot of space on the top of this. So we need to figure out where that is coming from. And if we kind of dig into some of these elements, there are a bunch of nested divs courtesy of WordPress. And we really need to figure out what some of these areas are coming from. So it appears that this div right here, which is actually two divs past our nav element, has some padding on it. I'm going to reduce that. So I know that I can go back to my nav element And I can't put this on nav, but if we click and make a rule for .nav div and do a descendant selector, I can change my padding to 0. And it doesn't look like that did anything. It's probably because those styles are being applied as inline styles. We've discussed this before, so if you're dealing with those inline styles, you are going to have to add that important modifier. And you can see when I add important, then it's going to override the padding and my navigation is going to look much better. So I believe that those are the two things that we need. Actually, if I take off the height, it doesn't look like that's really doing anything. So let's just add our padding of 0. So I'm going to do .nav div, and we'll set our padding to 0. And then I'm just going to add the important modifier, since in this case that is going to be a requirement. The other thing that I had mentioned is that I want to style the join a trip, and we had already given this a class, but I want this to look a little bit more like a button. So I want this navigational element to look different from the other elements. And you can see that this is a link. There's a span tag that's actually wrapping around the link text. And here's our trip button right here. So let's go ahead and make some changes to this item. I'll make a selector for trip button, and I'm going to set the background color. I'll plug in my hex value that I want to use. We probably are going to have to add a little bit of padding, and I'm not sure what those values are, so I'm just going to add maybe 4 pixels to the top and the bottom and 8 pixels to the right and the left. I'll save this. If we come back into our browser and refresh, it doesn't look like those things are coming through, and it looks like they're being overwritten. So we actually have more specific selectors here, which are overwriting these. Again, we have choices. We could add the important modifier, or in this case, I probably would be more inclined to add these additional classes so that I can use specificity to hook these elements. So I'm going to copy these selectors of WP block navigation. That's on the list item right here, which is actually on our trip button. We might not need that one. And then WP block navigation item is this. So let's just try adding this. I'm going to copy that. We'll return to our editor. And I also want to add a little bit of a border radius. So let's just try adding a border radius of maybe 8 pixels. If we save and refresh, we're still not getting those items quite yet. So we'll just have to figure out what is preventing those from occurring. And I can see now that the WP block item is actually at the same level as trip button. So we'll need to augment our CSS. And now you can see the button is being styled in the way that we wanted to. Now that I see this, I might want to add a little bit more padding to the right and the left. I think that that would be beneficial. So I'll go ahead and add that in, but I like that. And then I might want to do a little bit of a hover style. So I'm just going to use the same selector and add a hover style as well. We'll update the padding on the right and the left, and then we'll use the same selector, and then we'll just say a:hover, and we're going to change the background color, and we're going to use the same dark blue color that we're using for the background. And then I'm just going to add a border, and we'll make this solid, 1 pixel and white. And it is worth mentioning that if my original button doesn't have a border and then I add a border, this can sometimes create an undesirable jumping effect. I'll just show you. So you can see if I go ahead and hover over, and this isn't where we want it to be anyways, because you can see it's not working, but notice how it jumps. And that's because we didn't have a border on the original element. So this is probably not where we want the hover. We just need to get rid of that A on our selector. We'll just do something like this. And because I don't want the border to move my button around, I'm going to add a border to the original button, but I'm just going to make the border the same color as the background. So we basically aren't going to see it, but this is going to prevent the button from jumping. And as you can see, when I hover over, it's going to look like this. The final thing that I want to do in my navigation is I don't want the underline. I don't feel like that is necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the underline from the A elements. And I'll just do something like nav A, and we'll say text decoration none. I'll have to verify that my specificity works. But now you can see that we don't have that underline. All right, so that is looking pretty good. Currently, when I scroll, you can see that my navigation is going to disappear, which is fine. But what I'm going to do is we're going to modify our child theme so that if the user scrolls down, the navigation will disappear. But if the user starts to scroll up at all, we're going to have the navigation come back into view. And we're going to do this with a combination of some CSS and some JavaScript, which we will be adding into our child theme. We are going to be using our nav selector to add these rules, and there's quite a few rules, so I'll go ahead and just add them and then we can talk about them. We're going to start off by adding position fixed. Top is going to be set to 0, width is 100%. My height is 120. The background color, which probably isn't necessary since we already set that in the theme. I'm going to add a slight, very thin border on the bottom and a little bit of a box shadow. The text color, I don't need that because we already set that. My Z index is high so that this appears above anything else. And then we're going to use the transition property so that this creates a slight animation. If we save this now, and take a look, you can see that now my navigation has this little slight line. There's also a shadow. And if we scroll, it's going to stay fixed. So this is part of the behavior I want. When I made these changes to my navigation, it looks like it kind of popped everything up a little bit. So it looks like the top of 0 is kind of doing this. So we might need to add a little bit more padding into this element. I'll just do this here so that we can test this out. So let's try adding some padding on the top. 15 pixels, that looks just about perfect. And so now everything is vertically centered. So we'll add that back in. So this works. If you want a fixed navigation that's just going to stick on the top, you can do that. There is an issue with our hero image. You can see how this is now obscuring the hero image. The hero image is now sliding up underneath this. We're going to have to offset that by about 135 pixels. So when we go to modify the hero image, we'll take care of that. But before we do that, we're going to add some JavaScript so that when you start to scroll, this will actually disappear. And then it won't be visible until you start to scroll up again, and then it'll slide back down. So let's just add that padding on the top real quick, and then we'll go ahead and make our JavaScript. The JavaScript is going to reside in its own folder. So I'm going to make a new folder and we're just going to call this scripts. Inside my scripts folder, I'm going to make a new file and we'll just call this child.js. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add some JavaScript code in order to make a sticky header. So I'll start off by making a comment that describes what this block of code is going to do. And then I'll go ahead and just create the JavaScript, and then I'll explain what all of the code is doing. So what this code is doing right here is we are adding an event listener to the document. This is basically listening for when the page has fully loaded, and then it's going to add this scroll event listener that's going to manage the visibility of our website header based on the user's scrolling direction. This first line of code right here, the document.addEventListener, DOM content loaded, and function is going to ensure that the script runs only after the HTML content has fully loaded. This prevents errors that might occur if elements are accessed before they actually exist. The next two lines of code are where we're declaring a couple of variables. The previous scroll position stores the current vertical scroll position. This is assigned to be equal to the scroll Y position. So we're loading this into the variable when the page first loads. The header variable stores a reference to the HTML element with the ID of site header. And I don't think we have that on our header. Let's just jump into the browser. So here's my header right here. You can see I don't have that. So let's add that. I'll go into WordPress, and here is my header template. You can see that right now I have two items. I have the group, which contains the navigation, and we have the cover. And I guess we assigned a class of nav, but let's go ahead and assign a ID. If you want to assign an ID, we need to add an HTML anchor. So I'm going to give this a name of site header, and I'll save this. And if we come back to our page and refresh, you can see that now our nav element also has an ID of site header. Because I'm using get element by ID, I needed an ID here. Then we have a window.onScroll equals function. This basically is going to execute every time the user scrolls the page. The first variable, the current scroll position, is going to get the updated scroll position of the Y scroll position. And then we're using a conditional statement, an if statement. So we're seeing that if the user scrolls up, so we're looking at the previous scroll position and seeing that if it's greater than the current scroll position, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take the header and make an inline style and set the top value to 0 to make it visible. And we're also going to remove a class of hidden, which we'll be using to actually hide this. So we're going to need to create that in our CSS. And then otherwise, in the else portion of the statement, and this means that if the user is scrolling down, so this means that if previous scroll is less than current scroll position, that's the opposite of what we have in the if statement, the header is going to move upward out of view. It's going to basically move 120 pixels off the page. And we're going to add the hidden class to the element. And then this last line of code, previous scroll position equals current scroll position. This just stores the current scroll position for comparison into the next scroll event. So this script is basically going to hide the header when scrolling down and show it when scrolling up. The top style property shifts the header up or down, and the hidden class, we can use that for additional CSS transitions or animations. So let's go ahead and save this. In addition to making this JavaScript, we also have to now register the JavaScript. So you know from working with your child themes that you're not able to simply just add JavaScript or add CSS. You're going to have to use the function file to register those elements. We'll just go ahead and get into our functions file. I'm going to come down to the bottom right here and we'll just make a comment. Here we're using the WP and Q script. This is the WordPress built-in function that's used to properly load and include JavaScript files. The JS script child is a handle. This is a unique name that we're using for our script. The get style sheet directory URI dot scripts child JS.js is going to get the file path. So the get style sheet directory URI gets the URL of the active child theme directory. We're going to append this with scripts/child-js.js. And then this last part is where we need to specify some dependencies. The array is specifying that this script is dependent on jQuery. WordPress is going to ensure that jQuery is loaded before the script is loaded. Null just means that WordPress won't append a version number to the script URL. True means that the script will be loaded into the footer which is going to improve load speeds by avoiding render blocking and adding it into the head. So this allows us to load our child-js file from the child themes scripts folder. It ensures that jQuery is loaded before this loads, and we are loading it into the footer to improve performance. So if we save this, and it looks like maybe I didn't save my CSS, let's go back into the browser, and you can see that this disappears when I start to scroll down. If I start to scroll up, it comes right back. So I like this behavior. It's really nice because it kind of gets the menu to be out of the way. But then as soon as someone starts to scroll back up, they might want to access the menu so they could go to another page. It's going to reappear. And this is fully responsive. So if our site is in the responsive mode, you can see that this still works in the same way. We scroll down, it disappears. We start to scroll up and it reappears. So that is looking really good. I like the way everything is functioning so far. And it is worth mentioning that regardless if we're in the large screen or small screen, because I'm logged into WordPress, I have this black bar here. If you ever want to know what your website looks like without being logged in, which is how your users are going to see the website, it's worth checking your website out by using an incognito window. So if I open a new incognito window and I paste in my URL, I can see what this looks like. So you can actually see that there's kind of too much padding on the top. And if we inspect this and check this element out, we have that padding on the top. So we added that because it looked better when we were visually looking this as being logged in. But you can see that I don't actually need that. It's not really helping the way my site looks. So do check out your website in an incognito window periodically, just so you can make sure that whatever edits you're making are actually going to look good, not just how it looks when we're actually logged into WordPress. After all, we will get rid of that padding on the top. All right, so our menu is working really nice. All we need to do is alter our hero section a little bit. So let's move on to that portion of our website. You can see that we have the class of hero, which we've already applied. We're going to need to do a couple of things here. I'll make some CSS inside of the developer tools. We're going to add some margin top, and I'll just try adding 120 pixels to move that down. It didn't appear to do anything, and it might be because of specificity. It actually looks like this particular element, our hero element, has some inline styles. So we're probably going to have to add our friend exclamation important. And then you can see this moves down. That's a little too much. So I can go ahead and play around with these numbers and figure out exactly what that value needs to be. It looks like right around 86, 87, maybe 88. 88 looks pretty good. So that's the value that I'm going to use for that. The other things that I'm going to want to do on this particular page is I want to adjust the way the columns are created. So if we kind of do a little bit of investigation here, you can see that this particular element is using flex. So this div right here is our flex parent. And then we have two children divs with the flex items. The first one is our column pick. The second one is our column text, and they're using a flex basis of 33% and of 66%. I actually don't want to use those values, but WordPress kind of forced me to use something by default. So we're going to have to augment those. So this div of hero is wrapping around everything. I'm going to use that for specificity. And then I'm going to start to target this container right here, which is using flexbox to be able to control these elements. So you can see that from the hero image, we go down into one div, and then we're going to need to get the second div. And this div has a isLayoutFlex class on it. And then here's our call pick and our call text. So let's jump into our editor, and I'll go down to my heroes section right here. I'm going to add first that margin top just to pull the hero down a little bit so that that part is functioning. And then we're going to do a dot hero div. We may need to be a little bit more specific, but we'll have to check that out. Let's go ahead and give this element a maximum width of 1200 pixels. I'm also going to set the gap between the flex elements to be maybe 2 ems. And the next thing that I'm going to want to alter is I want to grab my column that contains the icon. So if we use dot hero, and I believe we called that dot pick call, and I'm going to set the maximum width of this element to maybe 170 pixels. And I'm going to set a minimum width on it as well because I don't want it to shrink down to be too small. So I'm not going to give it very much wiggle room, just from 170 to 150. If we refresh, you can see that this has altered a little bit. We haven't adjusted the spacing, but if I start to shrink this page down, you can see that it's still responsive. That part is working well. If my page is really wide, this doesn't get too wide, which was something that was happening before. We didn't look at it together, but this would just spread out and take up too much of the visual space. So I wanted to prevent that. And then I need to move this text column over. I don't want that to be so far away from this element right here. So here's our text column. It has the flex basis of 66%. The one above it, the column pick, has a 33%. And it looks like I called this the wrong name. So let's change that to column pick, like so. And we'll save that. That already has improved the layout a little bit now that I'm using the correct selector. So that looks much better. We still are going to run into a little bit of an issue depending on the size of the page, but this already looks better. There's not that huge gap in between these elements, which I'm liking much better. So now you can see this is looking pretty good. The final thing I want to do at the large screen anyways, at both size screens, are I want to adjust my button. So if we look at our button, we added the button wrapper to this div. I'm going to use that as a hook, and I'm going to grab the A element, and we're just going to change the background color, change the border, add a little bit of a drop shadow. So I'll go ahead and add that CSS right now. I'm also going to use a little bit of additional code to make a little icon show up here. I'd like to use a font awesome icon just to visually make this stand out, and we're going to do that with CSS. If you recalled before, we had already loaded our font awesome, so we have access to those elements, which is going to make it easy for me to incorporate them into what's happening. So for the button wrapper, I'm going to change the background color to like a 80% white. I'm going to get rid of the border, set the border radius to have slight rounding. I'm going to add a box shadow, and I had to use important because this was set as an inline style. The text color is going to be that same light blue. I'm setting my font size, some padding, and some margin. If we save this and check this out, you can see how we've kind of like customized this a little bit. So it kind of works with this area a little bit more. And then finally, let's add the icons. I'm going to be using a pseudo class of after to do this. So we're going to use our btn wrapper a:after. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the font family to font awesome. This would not work if we had not previously loaded font awesome, but remember in our functions file, that was one of the first things we did. We went ahead and included the font awesome CDN so we could have access to that. I'm going to have this display as a inline block element so that I can apply some padding. I'll add some padding on the left to separate the icon from the text. I am going to make this a little bit bolder by changing my font weight to 900. And then finally, in regards to having the font awesome element display, I'm going to use the Unicode method of applying this, and this is how we would add Font Awesome in CSS. So on the Font Awesome website, you can get the code that you need to apply the Font Awesome element as an I element, which we have done previously. But if you are on the Font Awesome website, you can also get the Unicode value for that particular icon. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And if we save now and refresh here, you can see that we get this little chevron icon. So that just helps the button to be a little bit more customized. And looking at this, I might need to just change the opacity to maybe like 90%. I'll make it a little bit darker so there's a little bit more contrast, but I think that looks pretty good. And before we move on, we just need to alter this at the small screen. So right now my screen is changing about 780, and you can see that we have a couple problems. I would like everything to be center aligned, and then I need to adjust the spacing here. So at the small screen, this offset needs to be adjusted. If we come into our hero and we have our margin top and we just start to bring this up a little bit, you can see that it looks like about 74 is what we need for the small screen. So we're going to have to move this rule into a media query, and then we'll just have to center these elements. So I'll change my button to have 90%, and then let's go ahead and just do the rest of this really quickly. We want this to be 74. I always like to develop mobile first, so I'll go ahead and just have this defined as the small screen option. Then I'm going to go ahead and make a media query, and we'll just add that rule back in, and then we'll change it to the 88%. This is going to be what's going to happen at the large screen for that particular element. And then finally, we're also going to have to adjust the alignment of some of those elements. Once again, we're going to have to make this the default style so that it happens at the small screen, and then we'll just move our other rules into the large screen. So I'm going to start off by just trying to add a text align center, and you can see that that fixes the text. So that is something that we're going to have to add to our hero element. And regarding the image and the button, these items are probably being controlled by the display of flex. So if we drill down into the elements that are controlling them, I believe it's this div right here that contains all of these images, the image, the block of text, and the button. And if we just add a justify content of center, that should take care of that. These rules are going to have to be displayed by default, and then we'll have to add a few things to overwrite them in our media query. Let's do that now. So on our hero div, we're just going to add a justify content of center. And then I'm going to use this same selector inside of my media query. And we'll just add that down here. And we're going to say justify content, and we'll do flex start. And we'll also need to be adding a .hero call text. And we'll use our text align of center. And then I'm just going to copy this rule and we'll put it in our media query as well. And we'll tell the text align to be left at the large screen. Let's save and check it out in the browser. And as soon as I refresh my page, this part looks really great. If I scroll down, the menu disappears. And as soon as I start to scroll back up, it comes back into view. And we'll check this out at the large screen. You can see this looks pretty good. And just to verify that the alignment is okay, I'm going to look at it in my incognito browser. So looking at this here, I can see that I need to just move the hero element down a little bit. We can do that by adjusting our margin top. So it looks like that value needs to be closer to 120, which is I think what we had originally, but because we were looking at it with the WordPress admin bar showing, that affected how it worked. But let's just look at it in the small screen. And again, we're just going to need to adjust this and push it down because you can see the logo is being pushed up. Let's see if that 120 value is still going to work. It seems like that looks pretty good at the small screen as well. And if we scroll, everything disappears, and then when we scroll back down, it reappears. So let me just make this change right here, and that'll do it. Now we've customized our web page. We've added some additional functionality to the menu as well as this hero image. This is a global change that is happening on all of our pages. And I really like being able to control the page in this way. You can see how useful child themes are to really be able to customize and dial your website in to look and function exactly how you want it to.